This is a podcast for HLSC 3Q20 Constructing Health Campaigns. Stage 3, Implementing Health Campaigns and Social Movements. It is part 2 of a 2-part podcast about the ways in which communication campaigns and social marketing campaigns can fail. This podcast explores disconnects between the ideals of planning campaigns and the real-world implementations of those plans. Find out how a poor understanding of target audience characteristics can sink a communication campaign, and understand how external factors influence the effectiveness of health communication and social marketing campaigns.
That's a really critical mission, I think, and one we're tackling today by looking, well, directly at the failures that practitioners themselves are talking about. Our conversation examines ideas from, peer-reviewed research articles. We're drawing on 2 really excellent sources here. There's a 2021 study by Cook and her colleagues, which systematically surveyed professionals about the common mistakes. And then there's a 2014 study by Goodwin and her colleagues, which gives us this fantastic detailed case study of a specific campaign that, well, frankly, sort of went off the rails.
Right, and I appreciate that framing, because this isn't just about, textbook theory on why things should work. This is about getting into the messy reality of implementation. We're really dissecting the F word here, failure, and trying to turn these shortcomings into, well, essential learning opportunities. For anyone designing or evaluating public health interventions, knowing these pitfalls of systematic failures, it's arguably more valuable than just studying the success stories, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's about prevention.
We want to give you, the learner, the knowledge to maybe avoid some of these self-sabotaging mistakes right from the get-go.
Exactly. Learning from what went wrong.
Okay, so let's dive in. Let's start with that big picture view, the systematic failures. We're beginning with the 2021 study by Cook, Lines, and Fries. They surveyed professionals about common mistakes in social marketing.
Right.
What was the core focus there?
Well, what's really fascinating about this piece of research, I think, is that it fundamentally shifts the focus you usually see in the literature. Most academic papers, they tend to celebrate the documented successes. Cook and her colleagues, they deliberately went looking for the opposite. They wanted to understand how social marketing professionals perceived their own mistakes and failures, systematically addressing the field's shortcomings instead of just documenting the wins. They weren't asking, what did you do right?
They're asking what went wrong, or what did you see go wrong?
Precisely. It's a much more, direct approach to finding the problems.
That definitely makes the findings feel more honest, maybe a bit more painful for the field, but honest. How did they actually structure this research?
They used an exploratory qualitative research design, specifically a constructivist grounded theory methodology.
Grounded theory.
Yep.
So they weren't starting with a preset checklist of failures.
Exactly. That's really important. They weren't trying to force the data into some pre-existing textbook model of failure. They were building a theory from the ground up based entirely on what the practitioners themselves told them. They let the mistakes and failures sort of define their own categories, which makes the findings feel very relevant to, actual practice.
And who were these practitioners giving them this hard-won knowledge?
Yeah, good question. They collected survey data from 100 established members of the social marketing community. This was over 2 years, between 2017 and 2019. And this wasn't like a student sample or anything. This was the voice of experience. The participants were real professionals. 42% were practitioners, actively running campaigns. 22% were consultants. And 17% were academics teaching and researching this stuff.
So a good mix of perspectives.
Definitely.
And their professional scope. What fields were they working in?
Very wide, actually, but predictably concentrated where social marketing principles are most often applied. So the most common fields were health, that accounted for 70% of respondents, and environment at 57%. Makes sense.
And how did they analyze all that qualitative data? Lots of open-ended answers, I imagine.
Yeah, they coded it all using statistics software and Excel. And importantly, they established inter-rater reliability for that coding. They got a Cohen's K of 0.76.
Okay. For listeners maybe less familiar, why does that Cohen's K score matter? 0.76 sounds pretty good.
It is pretty good. It essentially tells us how much confidence we can have in the way they categorize the findings, because they were dealing with complex statements about mistakes and failures, right?
Yeah.
They needed to be sure those categories were solid, that different researchers looking at the same response would classify it the same way. So a high score like 0.76 means there was strong agreement. It adds significant weight to the patterns they identified as these systematic failures.
Got it. So these aren't just random anecdotes. They're recognized patterns. But like all studies, there are limitations.
Oh, absolutely. And the researchers were upfront about that. They noted that while the insights are really rich, the sample size of 100 isn't statistically representative of the entire global social marketing community. And maybe more importantly, all the data is based on self-report.
Ah, yes. The self-report bias.
Exactly. We all know it's susceptible to bias. People might, be more inclined to report mistakes made by others or blame external factors rather than maybe highlighting their own campaign's shortcomings.
Sure, that's human nature.
But even with that potential bias in mind, the findings about these systematic failures are still incredibly instructive. You see the same themes coming up again and again.
Okay, let's get into those findings then. Finding set A, the most common mistakes made during design and implementation. What rose to the top?
The number one mistake, listed most frequently overall, was maybe unsurprisingly inadequate research.
Seems basic, but clearly persistent.
It's the foundation crumbling, really.
Right.
Professionals admitted they often failed to build that necessary evidence base before jumping into action.
And I'm guessing it's not just not doing research, but maybe doing the wrong kind, or not using it properly.
That's the deeper issue, yeah. They specifically cited things like little or no formative research, that crucial early work to understand the audience and test materials. They pointed to a lack of understanding of the priority group's real motivations, or, critically, failing to grasp the systemic root causes of the social problem they were trying to address.
So treating symptoms, not causes.
Sometimes, yes. Or relying too much on anecdotal evidence, their own mental models of what should work. Or even misinterpreting existing data and drawing completely wrong conclusions.
That reliance on anecdotes or gut feelings must be tempting, especially under pressure from clients or funders wanting quick results.
Totally. You assume your personal experience or what worked somewhere else will just translate. And that kind of speed bias often leads straight into the second most common mistake they identified: poor strategy development.
Okay, how did that manifest?
This failure almost always centered on a really crucial conceptual misunderstanding, focusing mostly on increasing awareness or education, rather than driving actual measurable behavior change.
Ah, the classic awareness trap. Making a slick poster but forgetting about the actual behavior you want people to adopt. Confusing communication with social marketing.
Precisely. If your goal just stops at informing people, you've basically built failure into the model from the start, right? Because we know information alone rarely changes deep-seated behaviors. This mistake also covered things like misuse of messages that were unclear, maybe too negative or fear-based, without a clear path forward, irrelevant, or just uncreative. But the really key part for social marketing was the inadequate use of behavioral levers, often forgetting or misusing the 4 Ps: product, price, place, and promotion.
Can you unpack that 4 Ps neglect a bit?
Yeah.
Especially maybe place and product. They sometimes feel like the forgotten siblings of promotion.
Good point. Promotion is the visible bit, the message, the ads. But practitioners admitted they often overlooked place or distribution, meaning making the desired behavior easily accessible where the audience already is. If the clinic is hard to get to or the healthy food isn't where the junk food is sold, the strategy is weakened from the start. And product neglect is huge. Not focusing enough on the quality of the product itself, the desired behavior's user experience. They weren't making the healthy choice fun enough or easy enough or popular enough to actually compete with the existing, often easier problem behavior.
So if the new behavior requires too much effort or isn't appealing, the message doesn't matter.
Exactly. If it's too much work, cognitively or physically, the strategy is likely doomed, no matter how clever the tagline is.
Okay, and rounding out the top 3 mistakes.
Mismanagement of stakeholders.
Who counts as a stakeholder here? And what does mismanagement look like?
Stakeholders are defined really broadly, basically. Any group affected by the program's success. And that absolutely includes the priority group itself. Mismanagement in this context usually meant failing to genuinely engage these groups. The biggest failure cited was using top-down approaches.
The we know best model.
Pretty much. Where the funding agency or the health professionals decide the goals, design the campaign, all without giving the priority group any real input on, formation, goals, execution. It's a failure to communicate with, engage, or coordinate with key influencers or community leaders whose buy-in you really need.
Which totally violates that core principle of co-creation, right? If you're designing for an audience without designing with them.
You're almost guaranteed to miss the mark on relevance, on context. That feeling that the program is being imposed rather than offered as something genuinely valuable, it just instantly undercuts its potential.
Okay, let's shift slightly. Finding Sep B. Cook and colleagues asked professionals about the least well-managed program elements from a list of 20. This tells us where the field knows it struggles, even if they understand the concept's importance.
Yeah, this list really confirms some structural weaknesses. The element ranked number 1, the absolute least well-managed, was weak evaluation and monitoring.
Not a huge surprise, sadly. Feels like a perennial issue.
It really is a long-standing, almost endemic problem in the field. Campaigns often run out of money or time before evaluation can be done properly. Or the evaluation is just poorly funded and only looks at simple outputs like how many brochures did we hand out rather than actual behavioral outcomes.
And the second and third most poorly managed elements tie right back to the mistakes we just discussed.
They do. It was a tie between partnerships and value co-creation.
Okay, so reinforcing that stakeholder mismanagement issue.
Exactly. It highlights that genuinely engaging the priority group and key partners is a persistent implementation challenge. Professionals know they should be partnering. They know they should be co-creating value. But in practice, they struggle to make it happen effectively, often defaulting back to that faster, easier top-down approach we talked about.
It sounds like there's this internal conflict. Practitioners know the principles like needing good evaluation and co-creation, but the external pressures of budgets, timelines, client demands, they force compromises on the process.
You've hit the nail on the head. And that leads us perfectly into the third finding set. The reasons cited for outright program failure. A significant number, 58% of respondents, reported being involved in a program that actually failed to meet its behavioral change goals. That's quite high.
Over half. Wow. And what was the number one reason they gave for these complete failures?
Again, it was poor strategy development. Primarily that focus on awareness instead of behavior change. If you haven't clearly defined the specific behavior you want to change and identified the barriers you need to overcome using those 4 Ps, for instance, you're essentially operating without a map, failure becomes highly probable.
But the second major reason cited, external influences. That's where the system itself seems to fight against the social marketer.
This is critical. These are the things the social marketer often can't directly control. Examples they cited included sudden funding cuts stripping out essential parts like formative research or proper evaluation, small non-negotiable budgets from the start, lack of personnel or expertise, and crucially, dealing with inflexible decision makers or clients who kind of set their own agenda. They demand a specific type of campaign, usually communications heavy, regardless of the evidence or the social marketer's advice.
So a campaign could be scientifically sound on paper, but if the client insists on a quick, cheap, awareness-only approach, the system undermines it.
Absolutely. The environment itself can be a huge barrier, whether it's a difficult behavioral context, maybe high social stigma around the issue, or just internal organizational politics and rigidity. It acts as this resistance force. And finally, the third main reason for failure was poorly designed program or behavioral objectives. The most common issue cited here, and we really need to stress this, was selecting too many behavioral objectives.
Trying to boil the ocean. We hear that advice, right? Keep it focused. Mackenzie Moore suggests maybe 5 or 6 target behaviors max.
Exactly, because trying to do too much leads to a diffusion of effort. The message gets diluted, people get overwhelmed, decision fatigue sets in, and they often end up doing none of the things you ask. Practitioners also mention setting unattainable goals, overly complex objectives, or poorly defined ones. Or sometimes, worst of all, having no specific measurable behavioral goal at all, just vague aspirations.
If you can't define success, you can't achieve it or measure it.
Precisely. That lack of focus means you can't design a targeted intervention, and you certainly can't tell if you succeeded.
Okay, that systemic view from Cook and her colleagues gives us a fantastic checklist of what not to do. Now let's see those very issues. Inadequate research, poor strategy, weak evaluation play out in a real-world scenario. Let's turn to the 2014 study by Goodwin and colleagues. It focuses on a physical activity campaign implemented in the UK.
Right. This was a campaign developed by a local health promotion team, and it was designed as part of a larger strategy called Liverpool Active City, or LAC. The overall goal was pretty standard public health stuff. Raise awareness about physical activity's importance, encourage people to participate in local activities, and ultimately help reduce obesity rates.
Sounds reasonable. How did they try to execute this?
They used what's called a point of choice strategy, so placing ads right where people are making decisions, or have dwell time on bus rails, telephone boxes, taxis, even prescription bags from pharmacies. And they chose to launch it in January 2007, trying to strategically tie into that UK commercial sales season buzz, New Year resolutions energy. The whole design played heavily on the concept of sales.
Okay, clever timing perhaps. But you mentioned their research method was a bit unusual. It was reactive.
Yes, exactly. They were operating under what they called a pragmatic paradigm. The study actually started after the campaign was already conceptualized and out there, largely because stakeholders, even internally, had immediate concerns about the design and how people might interpret it. So it was very much real-world reactive analysis. The study had 3 key parts. First, an in-depth interview with the campaign's lead designer. Second, a public on-the-street survey with 100 residents to see how they reacted. And third, maybe the most important part for learning, was a formative evaluation feedback session.
That feedback session sounds crucial. So they weren't just collecting data on the failure, they were immediately feeding it back to the designers and managers to reflect on.
Precisely, making the failure productive, essentially. So before we get to the public reaction, let's quickly look at the designer's intent. What were they trying to do? Well, the designer confirmed the whole concept was cooked up internally by the marketing team, signed off by the LAC manager. They intended the main image to be comical and non-gender specific, and they were using that sales theme like "Get Fit, it's a bargain" as a hook to promote health.
Okay, and targeting. Who were they aiming this comical sales pitch at? Specifically the highly obese population.
Interestingly, no. The designer explicitly said they did not aim it only at obese people. The intent was actually to increase general awareness among everyone about the high obesity levels in the city. They used this very blunt, kind of provocative tagline: "More than a quarter of people in Liverpool are obese." The assumption was this stark fact would motivate everybody, regardless of their own weight.
Okay, and here we hit that big implementation flaw, the one that perfectly echoes Cook's findings. What critical step did the designer admit they skipped?
Despite the designer being confident in the message, a pilot assessment was not integrated into the design process before the full launch.
Wow.
Yeah, they skipped the one step that could have validated, or much more likely in this case, completely invalidated their assumptions about the comical tone and that provocative tagline.
That is a direct, real-world example of Cook's top finding. Inadequate research and weak evaluation rolled into one. They just launched it. Okay, let's jump to the public survey results. The interpretation gap. This is where that systematic failure really hits the fan, isn't it? How effective was this high-visibility point-of-choice campaign?
The recall rate was, well, devastatingly low. 84% of the people surveyed had not seen the campaign image advertised.
84% hadn't even seen it.
Hadn't seen it. And only 21% had even heard of the Liverpool Active City Initiative itself, which was the whole program the campaign was meant to be promoting.
How could a campaign placed in supposedly high-traffic spots be that invisible?
It strongly suggests a couple of things, linking right back to Cook's external influences point. First, budget constraints probably limited the number of ads, their size, maybe how long they were up. The reach just wasn't there. Second, the design itself likely lacked impact. It just didn't grab attention. And the public confirmed this wasn't just general apathy. Over 90% could recall other public health campaigns, often ones that used emotion or a bit of a shock factor, like anti-smoking ads they remembered vividly.
So it wasn't that people don't notice health ads, it's that this ad was forgettable.
Forgettable and maybe poorly placed despite the point-of-choice idea. Suggests the place and promotion elements of the 4 Ps were really compromised.
Okay, so for the few who did see it, how did they interpret the message? Did the comical sales pitch land?
Not at all. The interpretation was miles off from the designer's intent. People largely fixated on that negative, potentially stigmatizing obesity tagline. They didn't really pick up on the intended positive promotion of free and fun activities. The negativity just overshadowed everything. 36% gave an explicitly negative response, and another 24% gave a completely incorrect interpretation. Some, because of that sales theme, genuinely thought the campaign was about selling clothes or promoting a shop's sale.
Oh dear. So the attempt to be provocative with the obesity statistic just created alienation.
Exactly. It created immediate distance. Many respondents felt the campaign was only targeted at overweight or obese people, which completely failed to engage the broader audience the designer wanted. They felt judged or singled out, which unsurprisingly resulted in very low behavioral intention.
And the layout. Was the call to action clear at least?
Apparently not. The layout caused significant confusion. People said the message lacked immediate impact. They complained they had to read all the spiel to even figure out what it was about.
So the benefit wasn't clear. The action wasn't clear. A failure of the product element, again making the desired behavior easy and appealing.
Absolutely. The value exchange wasn't communicated effectively at all.
And the bottom line, did this confusing, potentially alienating message actually motivate people to get active?
Not really. 67% of respondents indicated they were not likely to get involved with the active city activities based on this campaign. It failed those basic social marketing principles, like exchange theory or using a gain frame. The audience simply didn't perceive enough value or reward in adopting the new behavior, especially when the message made them feel targeted or possibly shamed.
Okay, let's wrap up this case study with that formative evaluation feedback. When the stakeholders, the designer, the manager, the health pros saw this pretty damning public data, what was the takeaway?
To their credit, they seemed to take it on board. They unanimously agreed there was this fundamental mismatch between their design intent and how the public actually perceived it, and the crucial self-identified failure, the critical lack of pilot assessment before launching. They admitted that was the safety net they skipped, the step that would have almost certainly flagged the message confusion and the low impact.
So their own internal confidence, maybe driven by deadlines or assumptions,
Yeah,
led them to skip the research step that sabotaged the whole thing.
it seems so. They also recognized that their attempt at an all-inclusive message ironically failed to engage anyone effectively, precisely because it wasn't really targeted and used that stigmatizing language around obesity. They realized focusing on the word fat or emphasizing obesity rates just created resistance.
Do they talk about future solutions, how they do things differently?
They did. They discussed potentially using weight or disease links only for very specific, highly targeted groups in the future. And for general population campaigns, focusing more on positive themes, fitness, well-being, rather than the negative state of obesity. And most importantly, they committed that future campaigns must follow social marketing criteria much more rigorously, emphasizing genuine consultation with the local population before launching, and ensuring much better communication and integration between the health professionals and the marketing team. They knew the theory. They mentioned things like gain frame, exchange theory, but they realized they'd utterly failed to apply the process.
Okay, let's try and synthesize all this. We've got the systematic problems identified by the experts in Cook's study, and we've seen them play out vividly in the Goodwin case study. The key lesson here seems to be understanding these disconnects between the ideal plan and the, well, often flawed reality of implementation.
Absolutely. And the first major disconnect really seems to be this problem of principles versus benchmarking. Cook tells us the top mistake is inadequate research, and the worst managed element is evaluation. The Goodwin case shows us exactly what happens when you skip those fundamental steps.
It really highlights a misunderstanding of what social marketing even is, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The Liverpool team skipped the pilot test, even though they knew the underlying theories. Why do you think practitioners consistently seem to cherry pick, focusing on the visible stuff, the slogan, the poster, while neglecting the rigorous background work?
I think it often comes down to confusing marketing communications with social marketing. Communications is about sending a message that's the output. Social marketing is fundamentally a behavioral science. It's focused on changing behavior by optimizing the value exchange for the audience that's the outcome. When practitioners cherry pick, they're often prioritizing speed, visible products, maybe client demands, over that lengthy, sometimes expensive process of genuine audience analysis, behavior identification, and impact projection.
So they focus on, did we print the poster? Not, did we actually make the healthy choice easier or more appealing?
Exactly. And that self-sabotages the effort by focusing on a shallow output rather than the deep outcome of behavior change.
And that reliance on assumption, what Cook called the practitioner's mental model, instead of actual evidence, it's just deadly. The Liverpool team assumed comical and provocative would work.
And without testing, it was just a high-stakes guess that resulted in 84% invisibility and almost zero behavioral intent. It completely backfired.
Which leads to the second crucial disconnect, the cruciality of genuine audience understanding and targeting. Cook's practitioners admitted that mismanagement of stakeholders, often leading to that top-down approach, is a common mistake.
And the Liverpool campaign is the perfect cautionary tale about generalization. Their approach was meant to be all-inclusive, right? But the negative, obesogenic language meant many people felt excluded, judged, or just thought, this isn't for me.
It proves how hard it is to create one message that resonates with everyone, especially on sensitive topics.
Absolutely. And the failure lies in treating the audience like passive recipients of information rather than active participants in co-creating value. A core principle of social marketing is involving the priority group early on. You need their input to ensure the message, the product, the whole offer is relevant, accessible, and desirable within their lives, their context.
If the public feels judged or distant, like they did in Liverpool.
Then the message lacks that personal investment needed to actually bridge the gap between intending to do something and actually doing it. It's why the stakeholders after the fact realized they needed that local consultation up front. Audience feedback isn't optional, it's fundamental.
Okay, and the third major disconnect area involves accounting for external systems and organizational structures. Cook's study highlighted external influences, funding cuts, inflexible management, difficult environments as major reasons for program failure.
This is where the science meets the messy reality of organizations, right? The Goodwin case illustrated this well. Even if the internal campaign design had been perfect, the budget constraints likely dictated the ad placement and how long they ran. That external financial pressure directly contributed to that shocking 84% non-recall rate. The external system weakened the internal strategy.
Plus, that organizational flaw identified in Liverpool, the lack of integration between the marketing team and the health professionals.
Right. When the system itself isn't aligned, maybe the marketing department has too much autonomy, or upper management dictates the budget and timeline without understanding the need for proper formative research, the campaign is basically set up to fail. The social marketer has to realize that part of their job isn't just designing the intervention, it's also managing that organizational ecosystem around it. They have to advocate for the process itself, educating funders and decision makers about why you can't just skip formative research and evaluation to save time or money.
Because if leadership keeps pushing for those quick, communication-heavy campaigns focused only on awareness,
They're essentially forcing the social marketer right back into that systematic failure model that Cook's respondents described. It becomes almost inevitable.
it really hammers home that success isn't just about a good idea. You can design the best campaign on paper, but if you don't secure the resources, manage the politics, understand the system, the effort can be completely undermined.
And the final synthesis point here, maybe, is recognizing that failure isn't just an endpoint, it's data. If we look back at the Liverpool case, the failure only became truly useful because they actually did that formative evaluation feedback session. If they hadn't, they might have just shrugged and said, well, that campaign didn't work, without ever understanding why, that it was invisible, confusing, and alienating.
And the practitioners in Cook's study are admitting they frequently skip the very process evaluations that would capture that crucial failure data.
Exactly. Which means the same mistakes get repeated. We need to get better at identifying shortcomings early and learning from them.
This has been really illuminating, a deep dive into turning mistakes into actionable knowledge. The insights from both Cook and Goodwin make it crystal clear that those systematic flaws practitioners admit to lack of research, poor evaluation, stakeholder mismanagement, external pressures. These are exactly what sabotage real-world campaigns. It makes you think about that entrepreneurial advice mentioned in Cook et al. Fail fast, early, and often. In the context of health campaigns, maybe the provocative thought for you, the listener, is this. How can we move past the ego, often associated with failure? How can we embed that kind of rapid, iterative learning, especially process evaluations, into every single stage of program design instead of just pinning all hopes and judgment on the final outcome?
Thank you for listening to this HLSC 3Q20 podcast. Dr. Lawrence reminds you that it's essential to do the readings yourself. You cannot rely on this podcast for a complete understanding of the materials. And of course, if you have any questions about anything in the course or just stuff in general, be sure to reach out to her. She always welcomes emails from you. Meanwhile, have a great day.